The Wayfarer's retro thrusters engaged, sending a 60 Hz vibration through the hull that I could feel in my boots and the pit of my stomach. We were braking, shedding the velocity built up over months of travel. LP 459C, a rust-colored smudge against the black, swelled in the viewport. It wasn't much to look at, a desolate planet orbiting a red dwarf star at the fringe of explored space. But it held a secret, a knot of energy buried deep beneath its surface that had dragged us and Celestial Corporation to this forsaken corner of the galaxy. They had named the system Celestial's Bounty, but they had named the planet Hell's Waiting Room. The brass had a sense of humor, at least. My eyes drifted across the viewport. I could almost feel the radiation, even through the ship's shielding. A thin, almost imperceptible atmosphere clung to the planet, offering little protection from the harsh radiation of the red dwarf sun. The surface was just rock and dust, baked by the distant, anemic sun, a dead world, seemingly. But that was the thing about appearances. They lied. Scans had detected the anomaly weeks ago, a concentrated, non-natural energy signature, vast and complex, buried deep beneath the planet's crust. It was an archaeologist's dream, or perhaps his most perilous nightmare. Celestial. They were everywhere these days, a corporate behemoth with fingers in every pie, from asteroid mining to xenolinguistics. Their hunger for new resources, new technologies, new anything they could exploit was insatiable. And they had a particular fondness for alien artifacts. I'd seen my share of their operations, enough to know that their ethical compass was, shall we say, a bit askew. Speed and profit were the guiding principles, safety and scientific rigor often lagging behind, lost in the balance sheets. We'd lost good people on celestial digs, seen things go sideways in spectacular fashion. My attention shifted to the men around me, reflected in the viewport's polished surface. Gunner, our security detail, was a block of muscle and stoicism, his eyes fixed on the planet below. He was ex-military, of course, one of the many the corporation had chewed up and spit out with an artificial limb and a severance package. He was all sharp angles and hard edges, his loyalty to Celestial as absolute as the gravitational constant. Useful, perhaps, in a tight spot, but his presence always made the fine hairs on the back of my neck prickle with unease. Then there was Dr. Hamilton. Brilliant, arrogant, utterly convinced of his own intellectual superiority. He was the best xenolinguist in the business, or so he claimed, though his track record was marred by a tendency to jump to conclusions, especially under pressure. He'd almost gotten us all killed on Tau Ceti 4 by misinterpreting a warning for a welcome. And finally, Patrick. Quiet, methodical, the chief engineer. He was the most senior of us, and the only one other than myself I'd trust to have my back. He was a veteran of countless expeditions, a man who knew the guts of a starship and the soul of a derelict outpost. He was somewhere below, probably checking the equipment, making sure everything was calibrated to within an inch of its life. He had the look of a man who had seen it all and knew better than to be surprised by anything. He rarely spoke, but his eyes, when they met yours, held a depth of experience that spoke volumes. As for me, Dr. Corbin West, I was the one Celestial had tapped to lead this little dance into the unknown. Why? Because I was the best xenoarchaeologist they could buy, and because I had a knack for finding things even when they were buried under a kilometer of solid rock and a few millennia of silence. My motivations were simple, perhaps even naive, compared to the corporate machinations swirling around me. I wanted to understand, to learn, to uncover the secrets of a lost civilization and add another chapter to the ever-expanding book of human knowledge. The adrenaline didn't hurt either. There was a certain thrill in stepping into the unknown, a siren call that had always resonated deep within me. This job fed that hunger. The Wayfarer completed its braking maneuver, settling into a stable orbit around LP 459C. The planet filled the viewport now, its rust-red surface scarred by ancient impacts, its features stark and unforgiving in the dim light of the red dwarf. Below us, a pinpoint of light marked the location of the landing site, near the anomaly's epicenter. A team of contractors, as Celestial called them, had been here for weeks preparing for our arrival. Their job, to breach the entrance to whatever lay beneath the surface and establish a base camp. They were not scientists, but hardened workers, used to rough conditions and tight deadlines. They were good at their job, but I knew their reports were to be taken with a grain of salt. They were there to dig, not to decipher. We touched down on the rocky surface without incident, the lander's legs absorbing the impact with a muffled thud. Gunnar expertly navigated the descent, his hands steady on the controls. As we disembarked, the first thing that struck me was the silence. Not just the absence of sound, but a deeper, more profound stillness, and the gravity. It was subtly off, lighter than Earth's, adding to the sense of displacement, of unreality. A group of figures in heavy-duty work suits emerged from the prefabricated structures that made up the base camp. They were covered in dust, their faces grim and etched with fatigue. Their foreman, a burly man named Wilder, approached, his hand extended. "Dr. West?" he asked, his voice rough. "About time you eggheads showed up. We've done what we could. Dug out your damn hole. Place gives me the creeps, though. Nothing but a bunch of rocks and screwy readings." He shook my hand, his grip like iron. "Any problems?" I asked, nodding towards the gaping maw in the rock face, now sealed by a heavy-duty airlock. "Besides the equipment acting up?" "Nah," Wilder grunted. "Place is just off. Quiet. And the boys have been complaining about headaches, nightmares. Nothing we can't handle, but..." He shrugged, his unease evident, despite his gruff exterior. "We even found some writing up near where we breached." "The entrance," Hamilton breathed, his voice almost shrill with excitement. "It's magnificent. Just look at it. The scale of this, the perfection of the circle. Who were these builders? What purpose could this possibly serve? It's utterly astounding." I followed his line of sight. The entrance was indeed impressive. It was a perfect circle, cut into the rock with laser-like precision, at least 15 meters in diameter. The edges were smooth, almost glassy, reflecting the floodlights in a way that made the darkness beyond seem even more impenetrable. The area surrounding it was reinforced with supports and scaffolding. The advance team had set up a proper airlock. We made our way through the airlock. On the other side, the darkness swallowed us whole. Headlamps flicked on, their beams cutting through the inky black, revealing a vast, cavernous space. The temperature dropped noticeably as we moved further from the airlock. It felt as if we were stepping into a tomb, a feeling reinforced by the massive, regular shapes that began to emerge from the darkness. We moved through the crunching, powdery dust that coated the floor. The architecture was monolithic, imposing. Buildings, if that's what they were, rose up on either side of us, their surfaces smooth and dark. They were constructed from a material that resembled obsidian, but felt different to the touch, almost organic. Geometric patterns, intricate and precise, adorned some of the surfaces, hinting at a level of craftsmanship that was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. And then there were the murals. Carved into the walls in vast, sweeping panels, they depicted the city's builders, tall, slender beings with 4 arms and large, bulbous heads. They lacked eyes as we knew them, instead possessing what appeared to be sensory organs that ringed their heads. Their bodies were depicted with intricate lines that suggested a flow of internal energy. In one particularly striking mural, they were shown manipulating streams of light with their multiple hands, while in another, they were engaged in what appeared to be a complex ritual, their forms intertwined in a dance of energy and shadow. It was Hamilton who dubbed them the Abyssians. The name seemed apt, given the city's subterranean location and the mysterious nature of its inhabitants. These murals were the most detailed record we had of the beings, and they were unsettling to look at. It appeared that whatever catastrophe had befallen them was depicted in some of them. There were depictions of them attempting to flee, and even fight what appeared to be a physical manifestation of their own fears. As we ventured deeper, the first anomalies began to manifest. A flicker in the corner of my eye, a momentary distortion of perspective, a sudden inexplicable change in temperature. My chronometer, a high-precision instrument designed to measure temporal fluctuations, began to register anomalies, localized variations in the flow of time, microscopic but measurable. "Readings are fluctuating," I reported. "Localized temporal distortions, minor but definitely there." "Anything on the scanners?" Gunnar asked, his hand never far from the energy weapon holstered at his hip. His focus was sharp, alert, scanning the darkness beyond our lights for any sign of movement. "Nothing concrete," I replied, "but the background radiation is unusual. There are energy readings, but they don't correspond to anything in the database. It's as if the city itself is emitting some kind of low-level energy field. Something is interfering with the equipment. It's not consistent, though. The interference seems to be moving around." Hamilton, of course, had his own interpretation. "It's the language," he declared, his eyes wide with excitement. "They encoded their history, their knowledge, in the very fabric of the city. It's a form of energy-based communication." "Or," Patrick offered, his voice a low rumble, "it's just a broken machine. Old tech, malfunctioning after who knows how many millennia." I tended to agree with Patrick, but I kept my opinion to myself. For now, it was just speculation. We needed more data. We continued our slow advance, following a wide, straight avenue that seemed to bisect the city. The buildings on either side were massive, their purpose unclear. Some were adorned with intricate carvings, others were featureless, their surfaces smooth and unbroken. We passed through vast plazas, open spaces that hinted at a once bustling metropolis, now filled only with dust and silence. The scale of it was overwhelming. The sheer size and complexity of the city spoke volumes about the power and sophistication of its builders. It made our presence there, with our crude tools and limited understanding, seem almost insignificant. Then we found the source of the energy readings, the heart of the anomaly. A vast chamber, easily 100 meters across, filled with a complex array of machinery. This was it, the Chronicle engine, as we'd begun to call it. The machinery produced a barely perceptible vibration, the air around it visibly distorted, like heat rising off asphalt, but without the heat. It was a bewildering collection of alien technology, its purpose both tantalizing and terrifying. As we approached, the temporal distortions intensified. My chronometer went wild, its readings fluctuating. I felt a wave of nausea, a sudden disorientation, as if the ground beneath my feet were shifting. And then I saw a distortion in the air, like the visual effect of rapidly expanding and contracting gases. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough. A figure, tall and slender, with 4 arms and a bulbous head. It was translucent, ephemeral, like a ghost in the machine. It was there, and then it was gone. No one else seemed to notice, their attention focused on the readings displayed by their equipment. "Did you see that?" I asked. Gunnar and Patrick exchanged a look. "See what?" Gunnar asked, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. "A figure," I said. "It was just there for a moment. It looked like..." "Like what?" Patrick pressed, his eyes fixed on mine. "Like the Abyssians. Like the ones in the murals." They didn't believe me, of course. They dismissed it as a trick of the light, a product of stress and fatigue. Had I really seen it? A phantom Abyssian, its form momentarily visible in the depths of their dead city? Or was it just a trick of the light? A stress-induced hallucination amplified by the increasingly bizarre readings we were getting from the city's core. The rational part of my brain, the part that had spent decades sifting through the dust of dead civilizations, screamed for a logical explanation. But another part, a primal, instinctive part, whispered of something far stranger. The equipment continued to malfunction, intermittently but with increasing frequency. My chronometer was registering more significant temporal distortions now, localized pockets where time flowed differently, faster or slower by fractions of a second. Measurable, quantifiable anomalies. Hamilton, predictably, was in his element. He flitted around the chamber like a moth drawn to a flame, his multispectral scanner held aloft like a divining rod. He was convinced that the Abyssians had mastered a form of energy-based communication, that their history, their knowledge, was encoded in the fabric of the city, waiting to be deciphered. He babbled about resonance frequencies and information density, his voice tight with manic energy. "It's a language," he declared, his eyes gleaming, "not of sound or symbols, but of pure energy. They've woven their story into the city itself, into these machines, and I'm beginning to understand it." Gunnar remained skeptical. He kept a watchful eye on Hamilton. I knew he didn't trust the xenolinguist, and frankly, neither did I. Hamilton's brilliance was undeniable, but it was often overshadowed by his ego and his tendency to leap to conclusions. In a place like this, that could be a fatal flaw. Patrick, as usual, offered a more grounded perspective. It's old technology, malfunctioning after centuries of neglect. Could be anything causing these readings. A power surge, a broken circuit, a loose wire. But even Patrick couldn't explain the increasingly frequent and vivid manifestations. It wasn't just me anymore. We all saw them now. Fleeting glimpses of the Abyssians engaged in their strange rituals, their forms flickering in and out of existence like faulty projections. They left behind no residue, no tangible evidence, except for the scorch marks that appeared on the walls after one particularly vivid manifestation, and the strange, localized gravitational anomalies that followed another. The affected areas were easy to identify. They dragged on our equipment, and they felt different underfoot. Each one was catalogued and carefully examined. We found a new section of the city beyond the central chamber that appeared to have been a residential area. Or so we surmised from the smaller, more intricately designed structures, the remnants of what might have been furniture, and the murals depicting scenes of Abyssian life. It was here that the manifestations became more intense, more interactive. We witnessed a procession of Abyssians. Their four arms were raised in what appeared to be a gesture of supplication or perhaps activation, their bodies exhibiting their characteristic internal luminescence, the patterns within their forms shifting and reconfiguring. They moved silently, their forms becoming momentarily transparent, then resolving back into focus as they transitioned between different points in space. Seemingly ignoring the physical layout of the city, they passed through solid matter, leaving distortions in the ambient energy field that registered on our scanners as brief, localized gravitational anomalies. The area under their feet left an oily, dark residue. It did not reflect light the way the rest of the dust did, and appeared to mark a path that could be traced back through several corridors. In another sequence, we observed them engaged in a ritual. This involved a complex array of machinery, distinct from the larger engine, that extended from the walls and ceiling, forming a network of interconnected nodes. The Abyssians manipulated these nodes with their multiple limbs, causing the network to emit focused beams of energy. These beams intersected at a central point, creating a localized distortion, a warping of space that our instruments registered as a brief but intense fluctuation in the space-time continuum. The longer the ritual went on, the more our equipment began to malfunction. Then the nature of the manifestations shifted. We witnessed a scene of conflict. Abyssians, their forms exhibiting signs of duress, wielding intricate, multi-jointed devices that projected focused energy beams. They were engaged in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to contain or repel an anomaly. This anomaly was unlike the manifestations we had previously encountered. It was not a recognizable form, but rather a localized disruption of space-time, a region where the fabric of reality seemed to be unraveling. Our scanners registered it as a chaotic confluence of gravitational and electromagnetic forces, but visually, it appeared as an area of extreme spatial distortion. It produced rapid changes in pressure that made us clutch at our heads in agony. Each of these encounters was brief, but their impact was significant, leaving us disoriented and questioning our understanding of the forces at play within the city. Each one seemed to drain power from the main chamber, as if the engine was struggling to maintain these projections. They seemed to be following a set path too, always starting at one point in the city and ending in another, regardless of any physical or perceived barriers. They did not acknowledge our presence. Tension within the team escalated. Hamilton's behavior became increasingly erratic. He spent most of his time at base camp poring over the data he'd collected, muttering to himself about communing with the ancients. He claimed he was receiving messages, that the Abyssians were communicating with him, guiding him. One evening, Gunnar approached me. "We have a problem," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It's Hamilton. He's been acting strange, stranger than usual. I found this in his gear." He handed me a small metallic device, its surface covered in symbols. It was unlike anything I'd seen before. Definitely not standard celestial issue. "What is it?" I asked, turning the device over in my hands. "I don't know," Gunnar admitted, "but I've seen him using it, near the machinery, near the manifestations. I think it's amplifying the effects somehow." We decided to confront Hamilton. We found him in the main chamber, surrounded by his equipment, his eyes glazed over, his body swaying. He was chanting, "Hamilton, what are you doing?" He didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear me. He continued his chanting, his body now bathed in a faint blue light. Gunnar stepped forward, his hand on his energy weapon. "Dr. Hamilton," he said, his voice stern, "we need you to step away from the machinery." Hamilton finally turned to face us, his eyes wide and unfocused. "They're coming," he whispered. "They're coming back, and they've chosen me. I am the vessel. I am the conduit." Then it appeared. Not a fleeting image, not a ghostly projection, but a fully formed Abyssian. It emerged from one of the distortions as if stepping through a doorway, its arrival accompanied by a sudden drop in ambient temperature and a spike in the electromagnetic field. It was tall, even taller than the murals depicted, its slender frame towering over us. Its 4 arms, each ending in those long, delicate fingers, hung at its sides. Its large, bulbous head turned, and where eyes should be, there were only those strange multi-spectrum sensory organs, now glowing with an internal luminescence. This was no projection. This was real, solid. It was followed by another, and another, each emerging from the distortions, stepping through from some other place, some other reality, silent and imposing. They were identical to the depictions in the murals, but far more imposing in the flesh, their bodies a shifting architecture of translucent tissue and glowing energy. Their forms were a complex interplay of organic and inorganic elements, a seamless fusion of biology and technology that hinted at a level of mastery beyond our own. Their skin was a semi-solid, translucent material, constantly rippling with internal energy flows that shifted and reconfigured in response to their movements and seemingly their intentions. The truth, a terrifying, paradigm-shifting truth, slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. The Abyssians were not extinct. They had transcended. They had used the Chronicle engine to shift their entire civilization to another dimension, another plane of existence. The catastrophe so vividly depicted in the murals was not their destruction, but their departure, their ascension. The engine was not just a recording device, but a bridge, a gateway between worlds. And Hamilton, in his drug-addled delusion, had reactivated it. Worse, he had called them back. The Abyssians did not attack. Not immediately. They scrutinized us, their multispectral senses drinking in our forms, our technology, our fear. I could almost feel their focused attention, like a physical pressure, assessing, analyzing. We were ants beneath a magnifying glass, our every move scrutinized by beings who had mastered the fabric of reality. It was clear that they were armed. Each of them carried a unique array of devices, seamlessly integrated into their physiology. These devices ranged from compact, handheld units to larger, more complex mechanisms that extended from their bodies, forming intricate networks of articulated limbs and energy conduits. It was evident that these were not mere tools, but extensions of their own will, capable of manipulating energy fields with a precision and power that dwarfed our own crude technology. A terrifying realization seized me, a cold fist clenching around my heart. Our weapons, our technology, our very presence here was utterly inconsequential to them. We were less than insects, ants crawling across the floor of a god's temple. They weren't interested in fighting us or conquering us. They simply wanted us gone. We were trespassers in their ancient home, and they were here to reclaim it. Hamilton, oblivious to the danger, saw only an opportunity. He stepped forward, his arms raised in a gesture of greeting, his voice, amplified by the external speakers of his suit, filled with a fervor that bordered on religious ecstasy. "We have come in peace," he proclaimed, the words, slightly distorted by the comm system, echoing strangely in the distorted space. "We have come to learn from you, to share in your wisdom." The metallic undertone of the speakers gave an eerie, almost robotic quality to his already unsettling pronouncements. He reached out, as if to touch the nearest Abyssian. The being reacted with blinding speed. A beam of energy, thin as a needle, shot out from one of its multi-jointed devices. It struck Hamilton squarely in the chest. He didn't scream. He didn't even have time to react. He simply ceased. One moment he was there, the next he was a pile of smouldering dust, his atoms dispersed by a force we couldn't even comprehend. Gunnar reacted instantly. He raised his energy weapon, firing a series of shots at the nearest Abyssian. The energy blasts dissipated harmlessly against the creature's form, absorbed or deflected by some unseen force field. The Abyssian retaliated with a gesture, a flick of its wrist. Gunnar's weapon flew from his hand, clattering against the far wall. Another gesture, and Gunnar himself was lifted into the air, his body contorting in an unnatural way. He let out a choked cry, his eyes wide with terror and pain. Then with a crunch, he crumpled, his body broken and lifeless. Patrick and I turned and fled, our boots pounding on the alien stone. The Abyssians made no immediate move to pursue us. They simply watched, their silent observation more terrifying than any overt aggression. It was clear they had anticipated our attempt to flee. We sprinted through the corridors, past the distorted landscapes, the echoes of the Abyssians' past, now a terrifying prelude to our own potential demise. The tremors were intensifying, the city groaning under the strain of the reactivated engine. We had to get out, back to the surface, back to the Wayfarer. We burst through the airlock, back into the harsh, red sunlight. The base camp was in chaos. The contractors, alerted by the tremors and the panicked shouts, were scrambling to evacuate. They were abandoning equipment, supplies, everything, their only focus to get off this planet. The Wayfarer and a handful of smaller transport ships were already lifting off. We sprinted towards the nearest one, a beat-up cargo hauler, its ramp still lowered. We scrambled aboard just as the hydraulics began to whine, pulling the heavy ramp upwards. I turned, risking a final glance back at the doomed base camp. That's when I saw them. The Abyssians were emerging from the airlock onto the surface. They flowed out of the circular opening like liquid metal poured from a crucible. There was a fluidity to their movements that seemed to defy the harsh, low-gravity environment. They weren't just walking, they were gliding, their feet barely seeming to touch the rust-colored dust. Each step was precise, covering more ground than should have been physically possible. It was as if they were manipulating the space around them, shortening the distance between each stride. They emerged in increasing numbers. It was then that I noticed variations in their forms. While the first few had been relatively uniform, these new arrivals displayed a wider array of biomechanical adaptations. Some were larger, bulkier, with thicker limbs and more pronounced energy conduits running along their spines. Others were smaller, more agile, their bodies leaner, their movements even more fluid. Their large heads swiveled, the multispectral sensory organs that ringed their skulls glowing with an internal light, scanning the surroundings. These were likely how they navigated and perceived their environment, a far more sophisticated version of our own crude sensor arrays. A few of them had begun to form what appeared to be weapons in their hands, the shifting material of their bodies contorting to form rough edges. It was a terrifying, awe-inspiring sight, the manifestation of a power that dwarfed anything humanity had ever encountered. They were like gods of an ancient pantheon, awakened from a slumber that should never have been disturbed. We were leaving a desecrated civilization behind, fleeing the consequences of our own intrusion. We hadn't just stumbled upon ruins. We had violated a sanctuary, a refuge painstakingly crafted by a species that had sought to escape the confines of our reality. The Abyssians, masters of energy, architects of their own trans-dimensional haven, had been dragged back into a universe they had deliberately abandoned. Hamilton's meddling, his misguided attempt to commune with them, had been the catalyst. He had unwittingly reactivated the bridge, the chronicle engine, and now they had returned. We were the ones who had called them. We were the trespassers, the unwitting instigators of a potential interdimensional conflict. The weight of that realization settled on me, a heavy, suffocating blanket of guilt and dread. Our actions had ripped open a door that was meant to remain closed. I couldn't say whether the Abyssians were malevolent or not. They had defended themselves, but they had not yet actively pursued us beyond their city. Their motives remained unclear. Were they simply reclaiming their territory, or did they harbor a deeper resentment, a desire for retribution against the species that had disturbed their hard-won peace? Our escape was not an ending, but a prelude, a terrifying glimpse of a future where humanity might be forced to confront the consequences of its insatiable curiosity, its relentless drive to explore and exploit, even at the risk of awakening forces it could scarcely understand, let alone match. The exodus had begun, but where it would end, nobody knew, not even perhaps the Abyssians themselves.